Welcome back to Philosophy for Flourishing, the show where we explore principles and practices for achieving and maintaining physical and spiritual health, and generally living the happiest, most fulfilling life possible. Today, we'll discuss some techniques for thinking more clearly, a skill that impacts every facet of our lives. Remember, you can subscribe to the show and listen to dozens of past episodes in your favorite podcast app. And if you like the show, please let us know by leaving us a rating. A week or so ago, I was speaking with a friend who is a writer that I really admire, and he mentioned a skill that he's not sure how to teach or whether or not it can even be taught. And that's the skill of formulating clear sentences. I immediately understood where he was coming from. As an editor at a journal, I receive submissions pretty regularly that caused me to scratch my head because I'm not really sure what the writer is trying to say. Unclear writing is often a sign of unclear thinking, and it's indicative of a problem that all of us face, not just writers. Clearly formulating our thoughts is a challenge that we all face, and it affects all aspects of our lives, whether we just want to relay some news to our family over dinner, pitch a product or a business idea, communicate with customers, or write the next great novel or work on philosophy, perhaps. The consequences of failing to communicate clearly range from the rather benign and humorous to the life-altering. My wife is Brazilian and English is her second language, and that means I get lots of laughs from mistakes of the first type. Yesterday, for instance, she got some pho. I think that's how you pronounce it. It's this Asian noodle soup. And after struggling to eat it with a spoon, she said, "Okay, I guess I'll eat it with chapsticks." But of course, she didn't mean lip balm. But on the other end of the spectrum, consider the thoughts of WordPress CEO Matt Mullenweg. WordPress employees have long worked from home and so must communicate constantly via the written word, whether with each other or with customers. Mullenweg understood early on that clear communication cuts down on the back and forth and frustration. So anyone applying for a job at WordPress is tested on clarity. And those who can't write clearly, even if they are skilled engineers or the like, don't get hired. And although Mullenweg may be more visible than a lot of business owners, he's certainly not the exception in this respect. We are constantly evaluating people based on how they speak and otherwise communicate. It's not an exaggeration to say that investing in your ability to communicate clearly can greatly change the course of your life. Communication is our most impactful general purpose skill, and a lot hangs on it. The job of philosophy, thankfully, is to help us think more clearly. It does not aim at putting men on the moon or products on shelves or 1,000 songs in your pocket, or anything else physical like that, at least not directly. The proper goal of philosophy is conceptual clarity. The classic symbol of this quest is, of course, Socrates, who puttered around Athens, quizzing his fellow men on what they meant by such things as piety, justice, virtue, honor, and so forth. Concepts are the building blocks of our knowledge and our sentences, both those we speak and those we merely think to ourselves. I'll talk more about clear concepts on future episodes, but for today, I want to talk about a simple question or standing order you can use to clarify your thinking, whether you're silently pondering a question, reading or listening to what someone else has to say, or sharing your thoughts with others. This is something I've been thinking about and using for the last several years in my own writing, in editing other people's writing, and more recently while teaching writing courses at Objective Standard Institute. Before we get to the idea, let's first look at some examples of poor communication and see if we can induce the principle from them. Here are the first two, which are really similar. We'll see why in a minute. A decision was made. And the second one, temperatures have been observed to be rising. Again, a decision was made, and temperatures have been observed to be rising. Both of these are written in passive voice. And in passive voice, the subject of the sentence, the grammatical subject, so in this case, a decision for the first one and temperatures for the second one, both of those subjects receive an action. So a decision was made and temperatures have been observed to be rising. And often, as in both of these cases, passive voice leaves unstated who is acting. In general, passive voice is not only less clear, it requires more words to say the exact same thing. Take another example. A decision was made to end Franklin's mission abroad versus ministers decided to end Franklin's mission abroad. The first one is 9 words and the second one is 6. So more words to say exactly the same thing and often a lot less clear. So that's passive voice. Let's set that aside for a minute and we'll talk more about it when we step back and try to induce our principle. Okay, let's look at some other examples of different types of problems with communication. Here are a couple. The necessity to rethink our system in order to correct it is evident. The necessity to rethink our system in order to correct it is evident. And another one. The lack of foresight and inability to provide clear direction resulted in delays. Again, the lack of foresight and inability to provide clear direction resulted in delays. Both of these commit the grammatical sin of nominalization. A nominalization is a noun form of what would otherwise be a verb or sometimes even an adjective or another part of speech. But it's often takes the place of a verb, and it's usually a long noun phrase, like for instance in the first example I just gave, the necessity to rethink our system in order to correct it. That's one big noun phrase. It works as the grammatical subject of the sentence. And in the next one, the lack of foresight and inability to provide clear direction, that's the subject. It's one big noun phrase. Nominalization is often paired with passive voice. So that's the case in both of the examples we just looked at. The necessity to rethink our system in order to correct it is evident. And just as with passive voice, the passive construction often leaves out who is taking the action. So if we look back at these examples, the necessity to rethink our system in order to correct it is evident. The implied subject here is us. In the second example, the lack of foresight and inability to provide clear direction resulted in delays. There's not even an implied subject. It's just left to the reader to puzzle out the mystery of who is lacking foresight and not providing clear direction. And just as with the previous examples, these can be rewritten much more concisely. So the first one could be rewritten as we need to rethink our system in order to correct it. And then we very clearly get the we that wasn't only implied before. We now clearly get who is doing the action. And if we were to restate the second example, we might do it as the foreman failed to think ahead or direct workers, causing delays. So here we have very clearly who is doing what. Okay, so that's the second type of problematic communication that I wanted to look at. Now let's look at a third type. Here's a quote from Immanuel Kant. He writes, "There are only two possible ways in which synthetic representations and their objects can establish connection, obtain necessary relation to one another, and, as it were, meet one another. Either the object alone must make the representation possible, or the representation alone must make the object possible." I'm no Kant scholar, but I did study Kant in college for a while under a pretty reputable Kant scholar who now teaches at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And anyway, I've taken a stab at translating this into my own words. So I've rendered Kant's passage as follows. Either we perceive things exactly as they are, in and of themselves, without mediating effects caused by our means of awareness, or our means of awareness creates the objects of which we're aware. Going back to Kant's formula, now I started with either we perceive things exactly as they are in and of themselves. But Kant begins with there are only two possible ways in which synthetic representations in their objects can establish connection. This is fascinating. So whatever we take synthetic representations in their objects to be, we hear from Kant that these things can establish connection. That's really interesting. We don't often hear about things like synthetic representations in their objects establishing connection. In fact, for most of our lives, the only things that we see that are acting are human beings, animals, sometimes inanimate objects we say act in some sort of way when they're really just acted upon. But the point here is that we have something taking an action which appears to be a pretty abstract thing, something that we haven't run into just in our daily lives. And we get something similar when we hear Kant scholars, for instance, talk about how Kant's system, divides the world into the noumenal and the phenomenal realms, the world of things in themselves and the world of things as they appear to us. This is really interesting. Kant's system divides the world into the noumenal and phenomenal realms. Well, this sort of thing, this sort of formulation, is for me a red flag. And if we look at all of the examples that we've looked at so far, all of them are red flags to me for pretty much the same reason. They don't clearly tell us who is doing what. So to refresh our memory, a decision was made and temperatures have been observed to be rising. Well, who made the decision? Who made these observations? The necessity to rethink our system in order to correct it is evident. Evident to whom? The lack of foresight and inability to provide clear direction resulted in delays. Whose lack of foresight? And then with Kant, there are only two possible ways in which synthetic representations in their objects can establish connection. Well, we aren't accustomed to looking out at the world and seeing things like synthetic representations in their objects doing things like establishing connections, just as we aren't accustomed to looking out at the world and seeing Kant's system, dividing it into two realms, the noumenal and the phenomenal realm. Whenever we come across writing or speech that says that some sort of abstract idea is doing something in the world, that is cause for slowing down and really thinking about the truth of the matter here. It's a common way to put things. It's a common sort of speech to say something like, Kant's system divides the world into two realms, but it's inaccurate. And this is actually what the philosopher David Stove called a success word. When we say divides the world, divides there is a success word. It actually is saying that he successfully divided the world into two realms, and that's not true. So the overarching principle here, the one that helps us look out for passive voice, for nominalizations with passive voice, and for formulations where abstract non-entities are taking actions, is to simply always ask yourself, who is doing what? If you can always answer this question, or if you always give yourself the standing order to answer this question, then whether you're trying to communicate your own ideas or simply thinking about something in your own mind, teasing out an answer to a question or a problem, or if you're reading someone's material or listening to them speak, if you just give yourself this standing order to ask, okay, who is doing what? I think you'll find yourself asking more questions, digging a bit deeper into a person's reasoning or into your own reasoning, and thinking more clearly about how things actually work in the world. Because we live in a world of agents taking actions, whether those agents are humans or other animals, perhaps an inanimate object being acted upon by an outside force. But we don't live in a world where agency is absent. We don't live in a world where there can be a lack of foresight or an inability to provide clear directions without there actually being someone responsible. We don't live in a world where there's a disembodied necessity to rethink our system in order to correct it. We don't live in a world where abstract ideas divide the world into two realms or establish connections or anything of that sort. And words can seep into our brains and make us think that these sorts of things are true. So if we just give ourselves the standing order to be really clear about who is doing what, I think we'll just find that our thinking is much better, much cleaner on the whole. Now, you might be thinking, when am I ever going to really use this stuff in my life? And I think if you start paying attention to it, it's kind of like if you buy a new car. You start seeing that car everywhere. All of a sudden, everybody has the exact same car that you just bought. I think that this principle, once you're aware of it, is very similar. You're going to start seeing people, whether they're speaking or writing, using the passive voice, using nominalizations, often to sort of inflate the sound of their speech so that it sounds more important, and also speaking as if abstract entities, abstract ideas can take actions when in fact they can't. Okay, well, I want to leave you guys with a quote from a book that I really like. And if you're interested in this topic, there is, in my opinion, no better place to go than Richard Mitchell. And the book that I really like is called Less Than Words Can Say, and it's actually available for free online. And I'll put a link in the show notes. Mitchell, in the first chapter of this book, I think it's called A Worm in the Brain, is discussing a friend. So Mitchell, just a little bit of background. He was an English and classics professor at Glassboro State College, now Rowan University in New Jersey. And he came to fame in the mid to late 70s as the underground grammarian. He started publishing these really witty, irreverent, what would you call them, satires, I guess, at the college. And Mitchell firmly believed that the language we use says a lot about the people we are, because it reveals a lot about how we think. He's making a point similar to the one I was making earlier, that unclear writing is often an indication of unclear thinking. And so chapter 1, A Worm in the Brain, starts with a story about a fellow academic, a friend, a fellow academic, a professor who decided that he wanted to go into administrative work. He wanted to become an assistant dean pro tem. And Mitchell says that around the same time, he began to lose his power of prose. He used to write to Mitchell little notes like, "Let's meet next Monday at 2:00, okay?" And shortly after he decided to pursue a position in academic administration, Mitchell began to receive from him notes like the following: "Please be informed that the Committee on Memorial Plaques will meet on Monday at 2, and the like. And he starts to talk about what it must be like to have this worm in your brain that causes you to speak like an administrator. And I want to read a quote. It's pretty long, but it's really funny. And I want to give you a taste of Richard Mitchell's writing because I love it. And I think if you go dig it up, you'll just get a lot of laughs out of it. So he writes, "There you sit, minding your own business and hurting no man. All at once, quite insensibly, the thing creeps into your brain. It might end up in the storage shelves of the subjunctive or the switchboard of the non-restrictive clauses, of course, but in your case it heads for the cozy nook where the active and passive voices are balanced and adjusted. There it settles in and nibbles a bit here and a bit there. In our present state of knowledge, still dim, we have to guess that the active voice is tastier than the passive, since the destruction of the latter is very rare, but of the former all too common. So there you are with your active verbs being gnawed away. Little by little, and only occasionally at first, you start saying things like, 'I am told that,' and 'this letter is being written because.' This habit has subtle effects. For one thing, since passives always require more words than actives, anything that you happen to write is longer than it would have been before the attack of the worm. you begin to suspect that you have a lot to say after all, and that it's probably rather important. This suspicion is all the stronger because what you write has begun to sound, well, sort of official. You say to yourself, fate may have cast my lot a bit below my proper station. Or, more likely, my lot may have been cast by fate a bit below my proper station. Furthermore, the very way you consider the world, or the very way in which the world is considered by you, is subtly altered. You used to see a world in which birds ate worms and men made decisions. Now it looks more like a world in which worms are eaten by birds and decisions are made by men. It's almost a world in which victims are put forward as doers, responsible for whatever may befall them, and actions are almost unrelated to those who perform them. But only almost. The next step is not taken until you learn to see a world in which worms are eaten and decisions made, and all responsible agency has disappeared. Now you are ready to be an administrator. Mitchell is a genius because he points out the moral implications, so to speak, of grammar and how we use words. And it's not always the case that those who don't indicate who is doing what are doing so evasively, as if they're trying to hide who is doing what. But often, or at least sometimes, it is the case. And if we're always asking ourselves to be clear about who is doing what, we can sniff out those instances and guard ourselves against really poor thinking. So I hope you find this simple idea useful in your own life, whether you're writing an email or interviewing for a job or telling a story or pitching a product or a business. Simply remember to say who did what, or to ask who did what, and always get to the bottom of that question. So there's certainly a lot more to say on the topic of clear thinking and clear writing, and I think I'll do many more shows on this topic. But I'd love to hear from you. Any questions, comments, pushback? You can get me at john@theobjectivestandard.com. And again, I'd love to hear from you. So until next time, I'm John Hersey. Here's to flourishing.